Hey y'all, this is Sam with the Roots of Change podcast, and we are live. We are just going to wait and make sure that folks trickle in because we are actually early this time. Okay. Hey Joe, how is it going?
What's up? How are you? Good to see you. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. We were just checking in with each other, and it's like, how do you even ask how's it going right now? But I'm mostly grounded in my life despite the chaos that is happening in the world.
Yeah. Well, life keeps happening, and we got to keep living. So there's always a reason not to take the vacation, not to take the time, not to go outside, not to listen to music or whatever. But the reason we're doing the things we're doing is so we can have the things that we need to be whole and healthy and well.
Yeah, we have to live in the future for the future too. So I know folks are trickling in, but I do want to just introduce myself and our guest, Joe Cardillo. So welcome y'all to the Roots of Change podcast. My name is Sam Chavez, she, they, he. I am a Latino, white, indigenous, two-spirit organizer, activist, and storyteller, and curious human. And I founded the Roots of Change agency right after January 6th of 2021 to build a healthy media ecosystem to support us through the current chaos that we are experiencing. And Joe Cardillo, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself, but just big shout out to Joe, who has been doing amazing work over the years. He did a ton of work in the 2024 election for disinformation, digital security, and other pieces. And so we are so grateful to have you as a collaborator for the Roots of Change Agency. Do you want to share a little bit more about you? I know you've been on a bunch, but not everyone knows who you are.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, and glad to catch up with you, Sam, and welcome back from your road trip. Joe Cardillo. I do a couple things. My background has been traditionally working in marketing, communications, startups, and tech. So I worked in sort of venture-backed startups for about 10 years. And then I moved into running my own business, which is called the Early Manager. I do coaching and training for, founders and managers of small to medium-sized teams. So I still do that work a bit. I also do, as you alluded to, work kind of tracking misleading content and finding ways to counter it and help people have a healthy and a better relationship to all of the information ecosystems. Some of that's public facing work, some of it's just kind of stuff where I pay attention on the back end and work with some partners. But certainly glad to be here and always thinking about information and tech and news and social media and a wide range of things. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and looking forward to hearing how your road trip went.
Yeah. I'm always grateful to chat with you because we can really geek out about all of our interesting big tech and media experiences, and also, find that hope for the future, particularly when it comes to tech and media, but also in our world and in our politics right now. I know we're going to eventually talk about my road trip where I was on the road in the United States for 60 days. I crisscrossed the country using this map atlas.
Oh, I love it. You still got a paper map. Excellent. Yeah.
I got the full paper map atlas. And so we're going to dig into that and what I learned on the road, about what it's like to live in Trump's America, but also the roots of big tech and media. But obviously, big tech and media and politics are right in our face right now. And it's really hard to ignore the destruction of the mainstream media and the takeover of big tech within our government. So, do you want to kind of start out and kick it off of like, how are you navigating this moment right now where it can feel really overwhelming, even though we knew Project 2025 was happening and being orchestrated? It's still a very shocking moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think I will say two things. Like, one, as you're, pointing to, just because the things and you're doing the analytical kind of like, here's what's happening, doesn't mean you get to skip the mental emotional processing of it. And living in a society where violence is sort of escalating, the rhetoric is escalating in a lot of realms and places and ways, and dealing with sort of this crisis or emergency that clearly America is going through and the people around us are going through, and people have different understandings of that, of course, but we're in a crisis moment for sure, and we have not reached the climax of the crisis. I would say, to be straightforward about it. There's a lot there, and there's a lot to process, and I think the important thing is to make sure to have the tools and resources in place, and then to be able to take some action, right? Do something with it, and so that's where I live a lot, is trying to acknowledge, but also like be sort of in a strange way, have a short memory, like be flexible, be resilient, be action oriented. That certainly I think is really important in this environment. And then I think the other thing that I would say is just being focused on what is really the root of the problem. And I'm pretty straightforward about it. We've certainly talked about it. I think it's clearly the 1%. As we're sort of being encouraged to attack other 1%. 1% of Americans are trans. 1% roughly are immigrants. 1% are Muslims. Don't quote me on the exact data. I'm just giving you the basic. We're trying to be directed to go after our fellow Americans, when the truth is that the 1% that is doing the most damage is the wealthy, the super rich, the billionaires and multimillionaires, and they're trying to turn us against each other. And I think that's the other thing for me, is just being focused on like what is really happening, and really being clear that the 1% that's been harming me and hurting the people around me is the ultra wealthy and the billionaires, and that's what needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's all of that is really great advice. And I'm thinking about, seeing the forest for the trees. And I think we have to do both. Like, we're going to have to really adjust our eyes throughout this process, because we need to see that like long-term history of like, this has been steadily building over centuries and decades. Like the deregulation of media started with Reagan in the 80s. So it's been a 50-year project to get to where we are now. Um, and we are in a very acute moment that is very hard and challenging to navigate. And so, like, recognizing both of those things, I think, is really important. And it's a way for me to like stay grounded too, because I am able to see like, okay, we've come a long way, and there's still more work for us to do. And so I sitting in this moment can feel so overwhelming that it makes you not act. That if you see the forest for the trees, then you can actually see that action, and you might not know what's going to be on the other side, but it'll feel a little bit better once you start taking those actions. You start getting out in the community, talking to people, exposing yourself to folks who you don't always talk with. Like, I think that's a big key right now, is just like being with other humans.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to kind of hearing some of what you encountered as you were going through the road trip,
Yeah.
because I think you're exactly right. That connection is what's important. And, I'm a big fan of like coming from a place of providing for my community, for my family, for the people around me, but also my broader community. Like, I have neighbors, right? And it's my job to go out and like spend time with my neighbors, from all walks of life. And I'm not just talking about politics or socioeconomics. I'm talking about everything. And, renewing that, I think, is really important for us. And, our neighbors aren't always just geographic. There are other ways of thinking about it. Folks who are going through the same challenges, struggles, or just have completely different lives. So I think that work's really important. And, you're certainly modeling that. So that is appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you want to get into some of the news of the day and just I think, kind of process it in real time? I mainly want to talk about like the news, because a lot of what we try to do with the Roots of Change Agency, and that you're doing, on Mastodon and with your writing, is to kind of give people that media literacy of like, what are we actually looking at? We obviously know that the mainstream media is primarily owned by billionaires, and big tech has their algorithms. So they're restricting and suppressing any content that could be supportive for us in this moment. And so I think that's what we want to do here today, is just kind of talk about what's going on right now, and then give that media literacy layer of like, how do we act? How do we understand this news? And then how do we move forward in this moment?
Yeah, where do you want to start? There's some options.
I don't even know. I mean, the most obvious is Kimmel, but I'm just like hesitant to even touch that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really very surprised by what is happening right now, which we've talked about that before. But I think certainly we do need to pay attention to censorship, and
Hmm.
I'm I'm a believer that like free speech is sort of one of those things that is incredibly important, but a lot of people don't really understand it or misuse it.
Yeah.
And free speech is the exchange of ideas and the working together and the constructive dialogue. It's not silencing people, and certainly if someone disagrees with you, um, and you can't handle a little bit of critique, then maybe your ideas aren't very good. Maybe you're a bit insecure. Maybe your weakness is showing through. And I think that is the shortest way of sort of summarizing the what happens when a president doesn't like what a late night comic has to say, and then has their FCC head threaten a bunch of network TV stations, Disney, ABC, etc. And then, those people kind of pee their pants, so to speak, and deplatform them, at least temporarily right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not really a good sign. It's not a sign of a healthy democracy. It's not a sign of a community or an ecosystem or a nation that is well.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I was thinking today, like, we could just have part two of our global organizing conversation that we had. I think it was in March, where, they're playing the Viktor Orban Hungary playbook, like the authoritarian world leader playbook. And it's been very fascinating to see how quickly Trump and the regime are kind of pulling in their power and locking it in. And I think a lot of that has to do with the playbooks that they've already had by other autocratic leaders and how they've suppressed the media within their countries.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think that's the context. If you, I was in Europe recently, and if you look at the history of far right extremism and the history of dictators and fascism, etc., history may not be an exact duplicate, but it certainly echoes what we're seeing right now, as you're saying, is pretty much standard stuff. If you don't like what your opponents have to say, then you silence them. You get their funding pull. You try to use the government or the law against them. That's authoritarian behavior, and that's no different than what Putin is doing in Russia. That's no different, as you said, than Orban in Hungary. It's no different than what's happening in Argentina. And there's those are contemporary examples. There are lots of historical examples too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the other piece too that I was like very interested in is like they released a lot of the internal conversations and how Disney made that decision. And it just feels like, very, what is it, obey in advance kind of situation. Like there was just like, well, it just might be uncomfortable for us. And so we're just going to make it less uncomfortable for us. And, I am thinking about the marginalized communities, like you said, the 1%, the migrants, the immigrants, the Latinos, the trans people, all of these people who are being vilified and attacked right now, like they don't have that luxury.
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure. And and I guess I'll just also take one tiny little detour and say, like, as a customer, I did not appreciate that. I've worked in a lot of early stage and startup businesses. You have as well. And Disney and Hulu are like, cool, we don't really care what our customers want. We're here for the other billionaires who are calling and texting us or sending their FCC commissioner after us. I'm like, that's not a very good product or service if you don't really care at all about your workers, your customers, your users, your vendors, your suppliers. Like, none of the people in the ecosystem of Disney and ABC had any feedback. It was just like, cool. Another billionaire and his billionaire pals called and said, you have to do this. And so we just did it right away. And I think,
Yeah.
again, that's just that focus, right, on what's really occurring here. This is a power grab by the 1% to control all the resources and to sort of control our daily lives in some really harmful ways, and not to sort of be responsive to community or to customers. And I'm not surprised by it, but again, I think Disney and ABC need to consider carefully like the standard they're setting. Because certainly, as we've seen with some of these sort of multi-million-dollar settlements, Trump said, "You were mean to me. You said not a nice thing on your news show," and then he, comes up with a flimsy lawsuit that literally every attorney in the U.S. says that would never stand up in court, but these companies settle it because they want approval for their next merger or acquisition or whatever. And I think that all stems from that behavior of not being accountable. And it's the 1%, right? It's the super rich kind of playing super rich games while they're raising the cost of life for the rest of us on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that kind of reframe too. We did like a whole deep dive on elite capture, and the book by Olúfẹ Táíwò. Sorry if I mispronounced that. But that is a really good book to be reading right now because it does illustrate how elites have captured so many different systems and institutions. And we want to talk about how do we act, how do we organize in this moment. And a lot of that has been hamstrung through billionaires, through the steady defunding, not just the Trump defunding. So do you want to transition into Chicago and their response to the National Guard? Because I think that is a key example of like how action can actually change things.
Yeah, I mean, let me use a metaphor that I think is relevant, and then I'll mention Chicago, and then another example that I think is really great as well, because the primary purpose of uh, of sort of messing with our information ecosystems and our basic stability is essentially it's fracking. And most folks are familiar with fracking. That's an oil and gas technology where they inject heavy, intense amounts of chemicals and high pressure sort of toxic stew into the ground, and they break up the substrate, and then gas comes out of that, right? This is a technical scientific term, but like when you frack, you go into the substrate and you break up a bunch of stuff, and then you grab the value, and whatever's left, which is just a shitty toxic stew of chemicals, sort of, not your problem, right? If you're a billionaire, you're like, I don't really care about this small town in southern New Mexico or Oklahoma or wherever. So this toxic stew sort of like spews out. And then, of course, you've got earthquakes and other things that happen when you frack, when you sort of fuck with the substrate.
Very first earthquake was in Dallas, Texas, because of fracking before I'd ever moved to California.
Yeah, right. And people in Oklahoma, can kind of nod their heads and go, gosh, this is like our whole life now, right? We have to deal with this, on a regular basis because of that. And I think that fracking metaphor is really important because that's a real literal environmental problem, and there's all kinds of stuff that goes into that. That's also the same process that these kinds of sort of 1% type people use with information systems. They buy up a newspaper, they put their competitors out of business. That's not capitalism, by the way. That's just sort of naked authoritarian stuff. But they do it all the time, right? And then, of course, now we have someone who's, I think, correctly defined as an authoritarian in the White House, and they frack sort of the information systems, and then what's left is the rest of us are in panic and stress and struggle. And I'm using that metaphor not in a heavy-handed way, but just say the point is to keep us sort of separated and isolated and mixed up. Because if we form collectively together, we're pretty strong. Collective work is really strong, and you'd be surprised at how few people it takes to kind of create strength internally. And so the whole goal is sort of to keep us in this individual, panicked, not connected state. Again, fracking being a good metaphor for that. And so the two examples that I really like one, which folks might not be familiar with, is the Big Ten. The Big Ten Conference, which is a sports and also an academic conference that consists of some of the hardiest universities and colleges of the Midwest in America, have banded together to really sort of deal with the impacts of this federal reorganization and this cuts and sort of this fracking. And they're doing an amazing, amazing job of it. I don't think the jury is out yet, but the jury is still out on that, but I think they're doing a good job of showing us the organizing. And there's a great article in the New Republic about that from a couple months ago. So go take a look at that. I think it's a good piece. And then Chicago, as you alluded to, also offers us this opportunity to kind of see what happens when people work together and sit down and align, and then come to an agreement like, no, we're not going to do this. And so I think you see the activists, you see the elected officials, you see business leaders and community leaders working together in Chicago, and guess what? It worked. Trump did what he typically does. He threatened a community. I'm going to come in there and I'm going to put the military troops on the ground, which, using the military against American citizens is just like dastardly and terrible. And the overwhelming majority of Americans do not want that in any state of the US. So he sort of made that threat. Everybody came together. They worked together. They found common ground. They did that collective work, and he backed off and tried to, I'm going to go to Memphis next. And so I think those two examples are really good ones for us to know that there's work to do and there's organizing on the ground to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I really love Chicago as an example because of like the long history of organizing in Chicago. It's been very wild because every single news event has happened like either a day or two before we show up or a day or two after we left. So the whole National Guard in Chicago, that happened a few days after we left Chicago. So I was in some Midwestern hotel room watching Fox News. And it's very interesting to see the messaging. And when you start to understand how they speak and what they're saying through what they're speaking, like you start to get that messaging and like the whole like, well, Chicago doesn't want us, and so we're going to go to a place like Memphis where they do want us, and like there's so many people in Memphis that actually want us to support Americans, like they have to keep that messaging going, and it has to be a constant like, let's pivot here, let's pivot there, let's focus on a really tiny little piece to distract. And that's their game. And so to your point, like having that steady base, it feels like we need to be steady in ourselves, but we also need to be steady within our groups and our organizations and how we're collaborating, because it can't be this stop start. It needs to be that ongoing supportive ground building. Like right now, if you're an organization, like start reaching out to those community organizations that you're close with.
Yeah, and
You know,
I'll give you an example. I mean, we're blessed with some pretty good community organizations here in New Mexico. Super appreciative of their work.
yeah,
But I want to give a very literal, tangible example of being creative. And we were talking about this a little bit ago too before we hopped on. Um, sometimes you go to the meeting, the school board meeting, the city council meeting, the special commission meeting on whatever, and you give comment and you testify and you organize people, but sometimes you stand outside the meeting and you make so much noise that that meeting cannot proceed as expected. And I'm just that's one example. I'm just being a little bit literal there, but I think that's the kind of structure and strategy that organizers do on the ground, and that all of us should be embracing and working collectively. Because if I go stand outside a school board meeting and yell while a school board is trying to pass some hateful, discriminatory policy that harms LGBTQ students, like I'm just one person yelling. I'm going to need other people. And maybe that's not the right strategy, right? Maybe yelling outside the school board meeting is not it. There are other options, but I think that's that collective work we have to be doing together, because we have to be more creative in this environment. As you have sort of really nicely put, like our news media and many of other institutions are not doing it for us, and so we have to be strategic.
yeah, yeah. And I have some advice for nonprofits, organizations, and like grassroots folks in today's tech and communications newsletter. Because I think to your point about getting creative, like we need to get creative in all of the ways. Like we know that we are being suppressed on mainstream media channels, but a lot of folks are on mainstream media channels, and so like, how do you get yourself out where traditionally digital folks would do that, while also thinking outside of the box? Like I just showed you, hot off the presses, I just created this new zine called What is AI Really? And we have a ton of zines on our website, so this is just the newest one. But that is where I have found the most actually. Like while I was on the road, I printed a bunch of these off and I gave them out to people while I was on the road. And that was the most effective outreach that I did versus trying to post on LinkedIn and get suppressed and only 5 people saw my post about this live, for example.
Yeah, yeah, and that's only going to continue to happen more, right? Like we've talked about how TikTok is about to be acquired by the Ellison family. That's Larry Ellison from Oracle and his son, who now also owns Paramount, CBS.
Yes.
They are already, and they're going to continue to sort of, eliminate and suppress the views that they don't agree with, that don't fit their sort of worldview. And so we have to be prepared to act differently in that. And I think there's an inversion of methods, but as you're
Mm,
alluding to, like print versus digital, like these things have a place. There's also an inversion of sort of power, and like this is one of the things that I've had this conversation with a lot of our local folks in New Mexico about around communications organizing is like, you can't expect the local TV stations to do the job of setting a narrative. They
mm,
don't really, they're not in the business of like, of being able to push back on their sort of corporate billionaire ownership. That this isn't to say there aren't some great journalists who work for local TV or whatever, but like that's a good example of a model that at the end of the day has been captured and owned by, these super ultra wealthy folks who have an agenda, and they're happy to make sure that these things that they own fit that agenda and broadcast that. And so we have got to be thinking differently. We have got to be doing things that they don't really have a choice but to cover. Instead of being like, hey, can you cover this? We have to do things that are movement oriented, where they're following what we do instead of the other way around. And I think that's a shift that we have to get used to.
yeah, absolutely.
And
Definitely
independent
from
media. Sorry, I was just going to say, like, what you do is so important because you kind of live between advocacy and journalism and the work that you do. You're an independent you know person that we can trust to do that work. And Roots of Change is that sort of beacon in that way. And there are many other local news, local advocacy, local content organizations that do a lot of that same work, or that cover a topic or a niche. They might not be local geographically, but they're local to that issue or that topic, and we have got to show up and pay for that,
yeah,
because that's a hedge against that sort of 1% ownership of everything.
yeah. And that's like my biggest advice right now is like the amount of people that I'm talking with who are like, something's wrong with big tech, something's wrong with media, we have to do something about it. The number one advice that I give is to stop listening to the mainstream news outlets and to start finding the independent journalists, the independent creators, not even just journalists, because so many journalists are coming from a harmful system. And a lot of them are kind of recreating that. Like there's a lot of individualism when it comes to journalism and creators right now. And that's why, like the Roots of Change Agency, we're expanding. I'm not getting any funding for this, but I'm doing it anyways because it's needed. And I want to show people what collaboration can actually look like, because like you're a collaborator, we have other collaborators where we're uplifting their work because they're doing amazing work on the ground already, but we don't know about it because the mainstream media and big tech are suppressing us. And like the the amount of conversations I've had with folks with less melanation in their skin to try to explain the suppression that I experience online every single day, it's like we you wonder why we don't have these resources. It's because of the elite capture. And so once you recognize that, we all have to like move our focus away from the box of the mainstream media and towards liberatory media that is actually speaking to people, speaking to creating action instead of just sitting back and freaking out. A lot of our media right now, too, is all about overwhelm. And so those are just the pieces of advice that I'm offering right now of like, what do you do right now? Find healthy media. If you can't find it, then come to the Roots of Change Agency because we're always uplifting independent media folks.
Yeah, I think what you do with Roots of Change is like an integral component of that. And by the way, I'm a paid subscriber and have been for a good minute here because I believe that if you want to see things different, you have to sort of have some value, right? Have some investment in it. And there are many other kinds of great forms of media. I'm also a paid subscriber to and a huge fan of 404 Media. They cover tech and startups. This is ex Vice and Wired journalists who sort of built their own journalist owned newsroom. We both love their work. So for media, Civil Eats covers agriculture and food systems. What a cool, important niche topic. They've been doing that for 10 plus years. And there's many other examples. I'm also a big fan of backers of those things, like Tiny News Collective does really great work. They provide back end infrastructure and tech for local news publications around the U.S. So they do really great work as well. And so supporting these and backing these independent organizations is really important. Both, there's a whole side there around funders and not sort of chasing, venture capital, blah, blah, blah. But also just like, people who are information creators, whether it fits specific journalism or it's a little bit different, that's rooted in community, rooted in the place that are doing that work, that are responsible to and accountable to their community, their constituency. Because again, to tap all the way back to the beginning, the billionaires, the super rich and the ultra wealthy, they're just thinking, how can I get another cryptocurrency deal? How can I chase AI? Insert sort of the next, insane thing here. I don't know, insane, but like overhyped, I guess is the polite
Yeah.
way of putting that, and accurate. And so the 1% can't be trusted to own or do anything with news publications or information publications. At the end of the day, those structures have some serious deficiencies, and that's what product safety standards are for. That's what real regulation is for, which we're not going to get right now for a while. But in lieu of that, we need to strengthen folks doing the work that you do and that do a lot of other kinds of, local information, local news systems work.
Yeah, absolutely. Like we have to feed the places that are doing the good work, because if we don't, they're not going to be around for much longer. And like we are obviously at a very critical moment where we need organizations that are independent, that are doing this work. And I also really, really, really want to uplift Latino, Black led, trans led, queer led, like look for those style organizations, look for those creators, because they have been experiencing what a lot of folks are newly experiencing now for much longer. And I know we're going to get into that with the trip and all of that and like the long history of the US, but definitely look for those creators. We talked, Sharon Hurley Hall is an amazing anti-racist writer and she needs y'all's support as well. So
Yeah. And I have an observation and I want to ask you a question because I think it's something that is, before we get into sort of the road trip side of it too, the observation is that if there is a superpower in America, it's our diversity and our perspectives and our experiences. Like that is something that I think has built, for all of its flaws and design issues, and there are a lot in America. I think that the strength of this nation, the heart of this nation, is our diversity, and that goes double for our economy and our small businesses, as well as our news organizations, our advocacy organizations, our nonprofits. Like, what a tremendous strength, and we need to be strengthening that now in this time. But I also wanted to ask, just like hit the head on the nail, because I think we're kind of talking through like how people can be active. I feel like I often have people be asking me this question of like, give me the checklist. Like, I need you to tell me step by step what to do. And so I was just curious, like, how do you respond to that? Because I feel like you must get that too.
I get that all the time. And it's really hard because a lot of that is just so deeply ingrained in our culture. Like we're gonna talk about on this trip the white supremacist culture that we live inside, and perfectionism is one of those things. And like we feel like we need to know the answers of what's going to happen on the other side. And my advice to folks is like know the next steps and then keep going. I was talking to another collaborator, Stone Carnes, yesterday about I can't remember the metaphor that I used, but it was like, we don't know the end of the path. I talk about this quote all the time of like, shoot for the moon, and if you miss, you land among the stars. Like, we have to get more expansive about how we're tackling these issues, because the checklist that is built by, that is the corporate speak, that is the way that they are thinking, that is the way the authoritarians think. And so the best way for us to go around that is to be more about creativity, more about our body and the depth of grounded energy versus our minds. And so that's where, if we want to be really revolutionary and we want to combat authoritarianism, we have to do the opposite of what they're doing. And that is being more creative. It is being imaginative. It is being more childlike than a checklist. And so, at the Roots of Change Agency, like our zines all offer checklists, but it's like that's the starting path to then deepen what you want to learn, what you need to learn, where you feel uncomfortable, where you want to, get in a little bit deeper, and feel a little bit uncomfortable too.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I kind of come at it from a slightly different angle, but I think it's complementary. I'm always
Mm.
thinking about like, what is that space between the rules and the rhythm? Because both of
Mm.
those things are super important, right? And I think that's part of what you're talking about. That creativity is like listening to rhythm. And I think about that in the context of sort of building businesses or communities or whatever, but also like, you know, you can't rely 100% on rules because sometimes they don't work, right? And like we're in a time when a lot of institutional norms, rules, regulations are being overturned. And so we have to lean more towards that creative, rhythmic based place to know what to do. And then I also think like when people, like, this is just my personal stance, but like when people are like, what do I do next? I'm like, if you're not taking action in a way that gives you information about what, oh, I learned that, so now I should be like, then you do need to look at your own information system and be like, am I not learning something here? What am I missing?
Yeah, definitely.